What if I told you there was once a king so physically disfigured that his own people believed he was marked by the devil? Meet Charles II of Spain, a monarch whose appearance was so unsettling. Even members of his royal court whispered that he had been cursed. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But Charles wasn't the victim of dark magic. His true curse came from something far more real and terrifying: his own bloodline. This is the story of how Europe's most powerful dynasty rotted from the inside, producing a king so tragically malformed that, when he died, his autopsy uncovered grotesque abnormalities, ones that only deepened the rumors and fears that had surrounded him his entire life. If you're ready to uncover more disturbing truths that history class left out, hit that subscribe button, because this is only the beginning of the twisted legacy of royal power. When foreign ambassadors first met Charles II of Spain, many were visibly stunned. Here stood the ruler of a vast empire, and he couldn't even close his mouth. His lower jaw jutted so far forward that his lips couldn't meet, leaving his mouth hanging open like a broken hinge. This wasn't a rare birth defect. It was the predictable result of 200 years of relentless inbreeding. The Habsburgs called it preserving the bloodline. In reality, they were marrying cousins, uncles, and nieces so obsessively that Charles's family tree looked more like a circle. His parents were uncle and niece, his grandparents, the same. Genetically, he had as much diversity as someone raised on a deserted island for generations. The result was mandibular prognathism, or what history remembers as the Habsburg jaw. Charles's teeth didn't align. The top row sat completely behind the bottom. He couldn't chew. Meals had to be mashed into mush, yet eating remained a slow, humiliating ordeal. Food dribbled from his mouth. Servants had to constantly wipe his chin during royal banquets. Worse still, Charles could barely speak. His jaw made speech slurred and wet, nearly incomprehensible, not just to foreigners, but to his own court. His mother, Queen Mariana, even feared he might choke on his own tongue in his sleep. The most powerful monarch in Europe was a choking risk, not due to illness or accident, but because his dynasty had gambled with genetics for the sake of power. And by the time Charles was born, that gamble had produced a living warning of what unchecked inbreeding can do. The infamous Hapsburg jaw was only the beginning. Charles II's entire body was a tragic masterpiece of deformity. His physical state was so alarming, it would have sent medieval villagers reaching for their rosaries in fear. At 35, Charles looked less like a grown man and more like a sickly child warped by some cruel, unnatural force. Standing barely 5 feet tall, his size wasn't the only issue. His entire body was bizarrely proportioned. His head was comically oversized, wobbling on a frail neck that struggled to support its weight. His limbs were thin and skeletal, while his torso looked compressed and hunched, like it had been crushed under invisible pressure. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8 years old. Most children take their first steps before they turn 1. Charles spent nearly a decade physically unable to carry himself, and even then, it was less walking and more a shuffling, unsteady lurch. Palace records describe him staggering from wall to wall, leaning on furniture like an old man, even though he was still in his supposed prime. His spine was so twisted, he appeared permanently hunched, as if carrying the invisible weight of a family curse. And in many ways, he was. Generations of inbreeding had condensed into one fragile, tragic figure. The damage wasn't just physical. Mentally, Charles remained childlike well into adulthood. He couldn't read until the age of 10, and even then, basic understanding eluded him. His tutors described teaching him as trying to fill a broken cup. Information went in, but nothing stayed. Emotionally, he was no better. His behavior resembled that of a toddler in an adult's body. Servants often witnessed explosive tantrums over the smallest frustrations, screaming, flailing, collapsing in hysterics, followed by eerie silence, where he'd sit frozen for hours, staring into nothing. Even his hair seemed to reflect his failing genetics. It grew in thin, uneven patches and fell out constantly, leaving his scalp looking more like a diseased animal's hide than anything fit for a royal crown. Court painters were forced to soften reality in his portraits, but even their best attempts couldn't fully disguise the truth. And the most terrifying part? Charles was getting worse. While most people stabilize in adulthood, His body continued to unravel. His decline wasn't just premature aging. It was something deeper, more broken. His doctors were baffled. They weren't watching a man grow old. They were witnessing a human body collapsing under the weight of centuries of genetic ruin. Here's where Charles II's personal tragedy became a European crisis. The most powerful throne on the continent was held by a king who couldn't produce an heir. Charles married twice in a desperate attempt to continue the Hapsburg line. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, a vibrant French princess, arrived in Spain expecting a royal husband. Instead, she found herself married to a man court whispers described as barely human. Their wedding night was a disaster. Servants reported Marie-Louise leaving in tears, while Charles looked confused and distressed. The truth was devastating. His severe deformities extended below the waist. Doctors described his genitals as underdeveloped, childlike. Charles had the sexual maturity of a boy trapped in a failing adult body. But the court refused to blame the king. Instead, they accused Marie-Louise of being barren. She was subjected to humiliating exams, forced to drink foul herbal mixtures, and endure endless treatments. Once lively and intelligent, she became withdrawn, consumed by prayer, and some believe slowly poisoned by the very cures forced upon her. She died mysteriously at just 26. Charles quickly remarried, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg. But things had only worsened. Now in his 30s, Charles's health had deteriorated even further. Maria Anna's private letters revealed her horror and her realization that producing an heir was impossible. The court tried everything: top European doctors, fertility rituals, even magic. Charles was examined, measured, and prodded, but nothing helped. Because the problem wasn't fixable. It was genetic. Meanwhile, all of Europe watched. Everyone knew that when Charles died heirless, the Spanish throne would become a battlefield. The War of Spanish Succession was already quietly brewing. The bitter irony? The Habsburgs spent centuries arranging marriages to preserve their power. In the end, their pure bloodline left them with a king so broken, he couldn't even fulfill the most basic duty of a monarch, to continue the dynasty. When medical science failed to explain or heal Charles II, the Spanish court turned to the supernatural. What followed were some of the most bizarre and disturbing religious rituals ever inflicted on a living monarch. Public exorcisms held inside the royal palace. The church offered a simple answer for Charles's condition: demonic possession. Father Froilan Diaz, the court's chief exorcist, declared that multiple evil spirits had taken hold of the king through witchcraft. But these weren't secret rites hidden away in chapels. These were grand, theatrical ceremonies staged in the throne room. Nobles and foreign envoys were made to watch as their king writhed on the floor, convulsing, while priests shouted Latin incantations over his trembling body. Father Diaz would start by forcing Charles to drink holy water mixed with ground-up relics, bits of saints' bones, and sacred objects. Unsurprisingly, Charles would become violently ill, vomiting and collapsing. The priests, however, saw this as proof. The demons were fighting back. The sessions often dragged on for hours. Already weak and confused, Charles was subjected to brutal rituals. Crucifixes were pressed against his skin until he screamed. He was drenched in holy water and forced to repeat Latin prayers, a language he barely understood. But the exorcists didn't stop with Charles. They became convinced the entire royal palace was cursed. In 1698, Father Diaz ordered a full-scale spiritual cleansing. Servants were told to gather any object thought to be tainted by witchcraft, including gifts from foreign courts, personal items of former queens, and even furniture. All were hauled into the courtyard and burned in huge bonfires as priests chanted prayers. The most unsettling part? Charles believed it was working. With his limited mental capacity, he was easily influenced. When priests claimed the demons were gone, he often felt temporary relief from his suffering. This created a tragic cycle. Each return of symptoms led to more exorcisms, more trauma. Things escalated in 1699, when Father Diaz claimed he had identified and cast out 47 distinct demons from Charles's body, each supposedly responsible for a different part of his illness. After this final, brutal session, the king collapsed and didn't speak for 3 days. The tragic reality was that while Charles endured these medieval rituals in the name of salvation, he was dying from real medical conditions no one of his time could understand, made worse by treatments that amounted to spiritualized torture.